one. Okay, guys, so this is Jerry, and we have an interview I've been wanting to do for a very long time. We have Matt McCraw from the Greater Idaho Movement. Now, I'm very passionate about this because as a person that's in California, we also have similar issues that people in Oregon deal with. So anyways, without further ado, Matt, welcome.
Thank you, Jerry, for having me on.
Definitely. So first of all, I also have to give a shout out to Monsieur Z for doing the interview that made me realize I could interview Matt too. So shout out Monsieur Z. How did you get connected with Monsieur Z?
Yeah, so Mr. Z has a website, Utahism, and on Twitter, and so I had got connected with him because his idea about moving state lines is it's a natural fit with what we're trying to do, and this idea that again these state lines are political tools. They're not set in stone. They're not handed down from on high. They're a political tool to group similar peoples for political reasons. And we used them extensively to map out the country and group peoples. And then it was like once we filled in, once we filled in all the space, we set that tool aside and never touched it again. But that was a mistake. We should be using that tool to group people. It would lower political tension and it would get people better government that they actually want. So that's how I got connected with him, because he's got a similar idea for across the country of how to better group peoples. So it was kind of a natural fit, and we had a great conversation.
I see. And how did you first think about this Greater Idaho Movement? What was sort of the beginning? Tell me about the inception.
Yeah, so I'm a lifelong Oregonian. So I was raised here. I grew up on the east side of the state, lived in the Portland metro area. So for people that don't know Oregon, people think of Oregon as this deep blue coastal state, which it is deep blue politically because of the Portland metro area. But when you actually get out here to Oregon, what you find is that we're really two separate states. There's the west side of the state, then there's the Cascade Mountain Range, which is a bunch of 10, 11,000 foot high peaks that separates the west side of the state from the east side of the state. And when you get on the east side of the state, it's a completely different geography, a completely different climate, and a completely different culture and way of life that people live out here. So this has been the case for Oregon since its inception, since it was first created, is you've had this huge divide between the West and the East. So my entire life, there's been this urban-rural divide, this east side, west side divide in the state. People are looking for solutions. It's been there since 1857 when the border was first put. What happened 5 years ago is that the polarization, the difference between the two cultures, the difference between what the people in Portland and Multnomah County want, which is a deeply progressive blue area, and they want the most progressive policies that you see anywhere in the country. That's Portland, and that's what the people there want. The people in the east side of the state are deeply red. The people out here in Eastern Oregon are very conservative, very rural, very religious, very Republican. They vote 70% Republican. Polar opposites of Portland. And what's happened over time, and it's always been that way, but what's happened over time is that our issues have gotten more polarizing and less tolerable to each other. So, for instance, when I was a young person, we used to argue about things like minimum wage and tax rates and things like that. And at the end of the day, I might think that a $15 minimum wage is crazy and it should be a $10 minimum wage. But if I'm having a $15 minimum wage forced on my community, it's probably not so intolerable that I'm like, I just can't live like this. I can't live under these rules. But over time, those issues have gotten much more intolerable to people. It's not tolerable for people in Eastern Oregon to have certain policies forced on our communities. We will not live that way. We don't want to live that way. And that causes a massive amount of tension. And we saw this in an extreme way during COVID. So COVID, of course, we all lived through it, and we saw the most extreme policies that we've ever seen in our lifetimes in the United States, stuff that I never would have dreamed could happen in the United States was happening. And especially in states like Oregon, because Oregon is deeply blue. They kind of had an alliance with California and Washington, the other deeply blue progressive states, and they implemented the just very severe lockdown policies, closed schools, closed churches, forced everybody into masks, forced vaccines on people to keep their jobs. And that's what Western Oregon wanted, and they were fine with it. But out here in Eastern Oregon, the people out here didn't want any of that stuff, and it caused just mass civil, not unrest, but I've never seen people as angry as they were during COVID in my town. And it was because we didn't want our businesses closed. We didn't want our schools closed and our churches closed. And so what ended up happening is you just had mass anger and mass tension politically that doesn't need to be there. And so we kind of had this bubbling up point during COVID. And it was at that time where I heard about the Greater Idaho Movement. So I didn't start the movement. The movement started actually in 2019 as a long-term solution to this long-standing problem. Very timely, started in 2019. In 2020, we had COVID, and it was just like everybody was like, hey, this is the solution. This is what we should be doing. This is how we could solve this. So I heard about Greater Idaho like a lot of people, and I said, that's a brilliant idea. I'd never even thought about the fact, hey, we can just move this invisible line. Like it was placed here for political purposes 168 years ago. We can move it and solve this problem. So like most people, when I heard about it, I had two reactions. That's brilliant. And is that actually possible? Can we actually do that? Because I think we're all conditioned to think that these lines are immovable because they haven't moved in any of our lifetimes in significant ways. So I reached out to the movement. I got involved slowly over time. I've risen up now. I'm the executive director of the movement. But this is an idea that is incredibly popular. And so we started 5 years ago. We had this idea. It was a small group of grassroots people, and they said, how can we solve this longstanding problem? We got people in the east of the state are different than people in the west, and the policy that gets forced on us is getting intolerable. How do we solve this? They came up with this idea and they said, we think this is a good idea. But really one of the brilliant things about the movement when it started, before I was involved, was they said, we need to go to the people. We need to go directly to the people because we think this is a good idea. But what we need to know is, do the people of Eastern Oregon think this is a good idea? So we started going county by county in Eastern Oregon and asking the people who live here, do you want your elected leaders to move the border so you can be part of Idaho? And we've gone to votes in 13 counties. So there's 17 counties in Eastern Oregon that we want to move all or part of. We've gone to votes in 13 of those counties, and we've won in all 13 of those counties. The people in those 13 counties have said, yes, we want our elected leaders to pursue moving the border so we can be part of Idaho. So that's how I got involved. That's been the process of what's happened. And so just so people know, again, because most people don't, any two states can change their state border, their state line. There is a process for it. It's through the Interstate Compact process, and it's been used dozens of times. In fact, there was an article that came out it was about a month ago now, and it said that they could find about 50 different instances in the history of the United States where two states adjusted their borders between the two states. And it makes perfect sense. If you have two states that say, hey, it would make both of our states better if we moved this invisible line and you started governing these people and we didn't, or vice versa. Of course there should be a process for that. The idea was never that we're going to draw the state of Oregon and that's the line that has to be there for the rest of eternity. It's the perfect place for this line and it can never change. That was never the idea. The idea was these political borders need to be movable. They need to be changeable. They need to be updated to reflect the people that live there and the political representation that people that live there want. So that's the process. Any two states can do this. We've gone to the people of Eastern Oregon and we've asked them, do you want your state to do this? They've said yes. We've been to the capital in Boise and Idaho. The people of Idaho have been asked through polling. They strongly support this. The governor supports it and the Idaho legislature supports it. They want the counties of Eastern Oregon to join Idaho. The people of Eastern Oregon want to join Idaho. But the Oregon legislature currently, and so just kind of sum it all up, where we're at in the process is the Oregon legislature has to agree to let Eastern Oregon go. And that is where we're currently at. So for 5 years, we've been asking voters, asking people who live here, do you want to join Idaho? We asked Idaho, do you want them? Those people have all said, yes, we want this to happen. But the people in Western Oregon are saying, no, we don't want to let you go. And that's where we're stuck currently.
I see. So the first thing I'm going to mention to everyone watching is I didn't even know the word interstate compact. When Matt was talking about, I had to write it down because, we all took government classes back in high school. We know about interstate commerce, we know about that stuff, but interstate compact. And I was looking up, I was like, okay, this is a very well defined term. It's a term that's been in our lexicon since inception. So I want everyone to go and remember that word and look it up. Look up the laws. Look up. Yeah, it's a great word to remember. So first of all, thanks for imparting that word on me. Now I have another word that I can look up legally. Interstate compact. Second thing I'm going to add to what you said is similar to how Oregonians experience this east-west divide. One of the biggest memories I had was at the end of 2021. I left LA County for a trip and I was outside of the LA County bubble, and I was in a Home Depot. And in general, this is not by the coast in California. And again, we were all stressed out about all the craziness under COVID, but still California, okay? But it was Eastern California. Nobody wore masks. Nobody cared. Nobody was yelling at people trying to, take away their freedoms. People just were going about their own business. And I was like, oh, I am in a bubble in the coastal parts of California. So what Oregon's experiencing is very similar to what I experienced. So like, I back up what you say. Like, a lot of these states have this big city versus non-big city divide, coastal, if it's a coastal state, coastal versus non-coastal divide, rural versus urban. There's like this divide, right? And we have to, as citizens, know our community doesn't represent everything, right? That's an important empathetic thing for a representative democracy. So again, I have to back up what Matt said there.
Yeah, and absolutely, Jerry. And this is one of the things about our movement. It's a really easy sell. And one of the reasons it's an easy sell is, hey, it makes sense. It solves a problem, and it's a peaceful political solution to a real problem, and people like that. But the other reason it's an easy sell is, our society has gotten really divided and really partisan, and there are people that just 100% believe this thing and people that are 100% on the opposite thing, and they just can't hardly stand to be around each other. But one thing that still is a very common belief and value across our country is the idea that people should be in charge of their government, and people should be in charge of what that government looks like, and it belongs to the people, and it should be the people who decide that. So self-determination is this deeply ingrained value that almost everybody in the United States supports. We go to votes, and even when our candidate doesn't win or our policy doesn't win, we believe, hey, the majority have spoken. That's what should happen. And that's a very so what our proposal is doing is it's not saying we're going to punish you or we're going to take you or whatever. Our proposal is just saying like, hey, we're not like you. We don't want the same things for our communities. We're much more like these people that live over here next to us. Let us just peacefully separate and join them. And it's something that people can get behind. And they even, so there's been polling done. So people in Eastern Oregon love this idea. We win every time we put it in front of people. We win, and we win handily. People in Idaho love this idea because Eastern Oregon is very similar to Idaho. Idahoans, understand Eastern Oregonians, share values, share politics, all those things. So it's a natural fit. Yeah, of course. You're just like us. You vote like us. You live your life like us. You value the same things we do. Come be part of our state. But even in Western Oregon, which is very different than Eastern Oregon, there's been polling done in the bluest part of Oregon, which is that Willamette Valley part from Eugene in the south to Portland in the north. And the polling that was done there, they asked people, if Eastern Oregon counties vote to leave the state and join Idaho, should the state of Oregon let them? And more people said yes than no, which shows you that the people support this idea. People in general, one thing we still all agree on is that people have a right to self-determination, and they should have the kinds of government that makes sense for their own communities. And that's what this proposal is, and it's why it's so easy to support on both sides of the aisle.
Absolutely. And if you don't mind, Matt, I will share a screen with maps that are very, very context giving. So if you can see my screen right here, right? This is for everyone who isn't aware. So these are some of the things that, so we'll just look at this. So this is the proposal, right? This is the proposal. It's like, these are the 19 counties, right? You're talking about 19 counties to join Idaho. Of course, this is the current So Idaho, and this is Oregon. And then what's really cool is looking at some of the other little charts, right? So like for example, looking at the presidential election, like
Yeah.
there, look at the
And what
states
you
list of
see there,
Iowa.
Jerry, yeah,
Yeah.
what you see is so Portland, the Portland metro area is in the that blue chunk in the northwest, part of
Oh,
the state. And so
okay.
that's Multnomah County is that little skinny one that sits on top. That's where
Hmm.
Portland is. And it's 850,000 people in a 4 million person state. And so it makes up about 20% of the population. It votes incredibly left leaning, 75, 80% Democrat. So what Portland wants, basically Portland gets. But if you look at the state, you have the Willamette Valley, which is got some blue counties in the coast, and then
Hmm.
everywhere else in the state is deeply red.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make any sense for those two groups of people to be forced together because of where an invisible line was placed
Yeah.
168 years ago. We can take that invisible line and we can move it so that the people in Northwest Oregon still get the kind of government they want. We're
Hmm.
not imposing or pushing anything onto them. They still have the kind of government they want, but it allows people in Eastern Oregon who have had government forced on them that they don't want for decades, if not longer. It allows them to get the kind of government that they actually vote for and want. It's a win-win, peaceful political solution, which is exactly the kind of thing that when you ask people what they want out of politics, that's what they're looking for. They're not looking to dominate people. They're not looking to force things on people. Most people want peaceful political solutions so that it creates wins for everybody and they can live their lives the way they want to live their lives in their communities. That's what our proposal does.
Yeah. And then, so here's, for example, measure 110, right? Look at the voting difference between. So why
Yep.
did some of these counties here on the east or on the west vote in favor of 110?
Well, yeah. So what you see? So Measure 110 was this proposal that kind of came out of the metro area that decriminalized all drugs in Oregon, and this was something that came. So the metro area has a big drug problem, and the metro area has a big homelessness problem, and
Mhm.
so this was an idea that kind of came out of the metro area. Like, well, how can we better serve these people? And maybe if we decriminalize drugs and we focus more on treatment, we can help this. This is a Portland metro area problem. It's not a problem for the rest of the state. So they came up with this idea, put it to a statewide ballot. So it passed because, as you can see, Northwest Oregon said, yes, we want to try this. Eastern Oregon, all those counties out here where we're at, where I live, we all voted no. We said, no, we don't want decriminalized drugs. If there's somebody that's, doing meth or smoking fentanyl, we want to be able to have the cops pick them up and put them in jail.
Yeah.
So we all voted against it. Southwestern Oregon is an interesting place because,
Hmm.
and it just goes to show how different regions are and why it doesn't really make a lot of sense often to group all these places together that are
Yeah.
different. So Southwestern Oregon is on the west side of the Cascades. So climate wise, it's a little drier, it's a little warmer than Northwestern Oregon, but it's still Western Oregon. It's not
Hmm.
high desert, mountain, time zone sort of, kind of when you think of Eastern Oregon and Idaho and the West in general. That's you kind of think of Eastern Oregon. That's not Southwestern Oregon, but Southwestern Oregon is very conservative. So most of those counties in Southwestern Oregon, Douglas County down, vote very Republican. They're very conservative. So an interesting thing about that is that even though they vote very conservatively, we actually our initial proposal was to include Southern Oregon as part of Idaho. And we went to counties in Southern Oregon and we asked it 3 different times. We asked counties, do you want your elected leaders to be uh, uh, to pursue becoming part of Idaho? And we lost all 3 of those elections. And
Oh.
what that told us, Jerry, because we don't lose in Eastern Oregon, we win and we win handily. But what that told us is that even though Southern Oregon is conservative, they don't necessarily want to be part of Idaho for whatever reason. They don't identify with Idaho. They don't feel like they share culturally, geographically, economically like Idaho. Um, and that's okay. We weren't, that's okay. We
Mhm.
asked the people because we wanted to know, do you want us to advocate for you to do this or not? They told us no. So we said, okay. And we moved on. We're focused on advocating for Eastern Oregon. But that's exactly what we should be doing. We should be asking people, what do you want for your future? What do you want? Let's put you in charge. You tell us what to do, and then let's make that happen. And so Southern Oregon said they don't want to be part of Idaho. They're not necessarily happy with a lot of things that happen in Oregon, but they don't want to be part of Idaho. That's fine. They stay. But those of us in Eastern Oregon who have voted and said, yes, we do want to leave, Western Oregon needs to let us go.
Yeah. Wow. Again, thanks for clarifying that. That's again, it shows why I'm a big fan of you guys, right? It's all about let people decide. Okay, if they don't want to leave, they don't want to leave. If they want to leave, let them leave. Basically, in a
Absolutely.
sentence.
And Jerry, that's how most people view things. You know, if you talk to politicians, there's this very kind of team sports aspect to politics, right? If you're in the business and you're in that world, there's team red, there's team blue, and it's all about power dynamics and does this help team red, does this help team blue? But that's not how most people view politics. Most people view politics as what's the minimum amount I have to engage to ensure that I can live my life the way I want to and raise my family the way I want to and run my business in my community and you know, and I'll do whatever the bare minimum is to ensure that I can live my life the way that is the healthiest and best for me and my family. And so, you know, most people, when you say, if Eastern Oregonians want to join Idaho, should you let them? Most people are like, well, yes. I mean, why would we hold people captive who don't want to be part of this anymore? But there's a disconnect between what the general population thinks and what people feel about this situation and what happens at the legislative level. And so, for instance, we've had bills in the Oregon legislature for 2 sessions, consecutive long sessions, asking the Oregon legislature to begin to border talks with Idaho to let Eastern Oregon go. So even though when polling was done of Western Oregon, more people than not said we should let Eastern Oregon go, we have had not a single Democrat legislator who's been supportive of our idea. So in Oregon, there's a supermajority of Democrats in the state House and state Senate. And so that's 90 people, right? And out of those 90 people, well, whatever that number is, it's like 51 or 50. Some of them are Democrats, and the rest, it's even more pronounced than that. It's like 60 of them are Democrats and 30 are Republicans. We've had one of those 60 people that said he would possibly support it if certain parameters were met or conditions were met. But we have had 0 other legislators that have been willing to support the idea of letting Eastern Oregon go, even though the people they represent, you know, 45% of the people they represent think we should let Eastern Oregon go, and only 40% oppose it. But we only have 1 out of 60 legislators, and we see that often that the elected leaders are not doing what the people want them to do, and especially in this situation.
And this is something that I learned about Oregon. So this year I passed a course on taxes. So I learned that Oregon has really complicated state taxes. You know, California has complicated state taxes. Maryland has pretty complicated, but like Oregon has really complicated state taxes. And I'm sure that's something that you talk to East Oregonians. They're like, why do we have to deal with this? I'm sure, right? Do you have
absolutely.
any information on that?
Yeah, because Eastern Oregon is very conservative, and like most conservative places, they want the people who live here want smaller government. We're very independent minded. This is very typical, you know, conservative Western people, you know, self-reliant, individualist. We want freedom and value faith, family freedom, and we want the government out of our business as much as possible. That's pretty typical way of thinking out here in Eastern Oregon. And it's not the typical way of thinking in Western Oregon. Again, Jerry, that's fine. The people in Portland think differently than the people in Eastern Oregon. They have a different culture, and that's okay. But what's not okay is for the people in Portland to force that policy and that culture and that way of life onto people in Eastern Oregon who don't want it and feel like it harms us. So let's figure out a way to separate these 2 groups of people so both people can live harmoniously next to each other in the way that works best for them and their communities.
And when Oregon was founded as a state, was it mostly conservative? Was it kind of a little bit of both? How was Oregon, like a lot of people ask, like, how did Oregon get clumped up like that?
Yeah, so great question, Jerry, and I'm really glad you brought this up because I'm a lifelong Oregonian. I was born here. I've lived here I'm 49 years old. I lived all but 2 years here, and those 2 years I was just barely across the Columbia River. I could still see Oregon from my front porch. So I've lived my whole life here. I had no idea the history of how my own state came to be, but it's important when you know the history because it just well you'll see. So in 1857. The Oregon Territory was like all of Washington, all of Oregon, and Idaho.
That's
And so they
right.
started wanting to carve this up into states. So Oregon was the first state that got carved up. And they held a constitutional convention, the first Oregon Constitutional Convention in 1857. And there were 60 delegates at the first Constitutional Convention. At the time, what's now Oregon had about 50,000 people lived in the whole area. So they had 60 delegates that came to this first convention. 59 of the 60 delegates came from west of the Cascades. So they came from the Willamette Valley. And that's because the Willamette Valley was always the fertile soil. It was the promised land. It was where people were going. It's hard to scratch out an existence in Eastern Oregon because we have very little water, and it's cold. It's extreme weather. It's harsher conditions. It was the Willamette Valley where people were going to get to build their societies and farms and make a new life for themselves. So 50,000 people lived in the whole state. 59 of the 60 delegates were from Western Oregon. One delegate came from east of the Cascades to represent all of this area. In that first Constitutional Convention, the one delegate from Eastern Oregon said, I support my people, the people I represent support the people of Eastern Oregon, putting the border for Oregon along the Cascade Mountain Range because it's so obviously clear that Western Oregon will always be different than Eastern Oregon. It's different geographically, it's different climate-wise, it's going to grow differently. Eastern Oregon is never going to support the types of populations that Western Oregon will support just because of the agriculture and everything else. So at 1857, when they were putting the line, the people in Eastern Oregon said, we want it along the Cascade Mountain Range because that's where it makes the most sense. The 59 delegates of Western Oregon said, no, we want all that land out east to be part of our state. We want a big footprint. We want a lot of land mass for our state. And they overrode what the wishes of people of Eastern Oregon and forced Eastern Oregon into the state. And that's how the border got placed there. Eastern Oregon never belonged with Western Oregon, never wanted to be grouped with Western Oregon, was forced into association with Western Oregon by Western Oregonians. And we've been stuck there for the last 168 years. After 165 years, we start voting and saying, we don't want to be stuck here anymore. We want a chance to chart our own path, to choose our own state government and not be at the mercy and the will of what the people that live hundreds of miles away in the Portland metro area want.
And so basically this Greater Idaho Movement's the first time you guys have really kind of spoken up and done, or have there been past times before?
So there have been other movements. And so there was something called the State of Jefferson, which was very popular and got very big. And it was in Northern California and Southern Oregon. And again, these movements actually pop up all over the place. There's several going on in the United States right now. The Indiana legislature just passed a bill signed by the governor creating a commission to look into absorbing the southern counties of Illinois. So there's 33 counties in Illinois that have voted to separate from Illinois because they have the same problem. You've got Chicago, which is a completely different culture. Then you get downstate Illinois, where it's more farmland and rural. The people that live in these two places could not be more different, and yet one forces policy onto the other that the other people don't want. So these movements crop up all the time, these self-determination movements that say, hey, how do we get better representation that actually matches what the people who live here want? So that's happened in Oregon as well, and it happened with the state of Jefferson. But what tends to happen with these movements is these self-determination movements bubble up and people say, hey, we want to separate. We just want to peacefully separate and get better representation. The people that rule over them or that have them under their control, in this case, it's the state of Oregon. We have to ask permission from the people who are ruling over us, oppressing us, essentially. We have to ask for their permission to be able to separate. And so what tends to happen is the people who are ruling over people, they don't necessarily want to give up that control. They don't want to give away land, resources, people that they govern and control. So they say, no, we're not going to do it. And eventually these movements lose momentum because that is the process. The process is we can't just unilaterally say we're out and secede. The process is we need the state of Oregon to give us permission to go join the state of Idaho, and then have the two states come together and say, here's the counties that are going to move under your governance, leave ours, and go to yours. And unfortunately, the state of Oregon is unwilling to respect the votes of Eastern Oregonians. They're more interested in holding us captive as part of the state than respecting what we actually want.
Yeah. And I think about this because obviously the word federalism, right, is something that defined America. Unfortunately, America got a little lopsided. The big government on top's becoming bigger and bigger, whereas
Mhm.
before, I think initially they wanted it like this, the local most
Yep.
powerful, and then it sort of became like this, and now it's like this. But long story short, I can imagine that if some of um, Oregon goes to Idaho, even from the electoral college, Oregon's going to lose a few votes, right? So
Yeah.
that's
So
something that would add resistance.
it is, Jerry, and you're right, and that goes back to this kind of team sport thing we were talking about earlier, right? Like a person that lives in Eastern Oregon isn't worried about what's happening to the electoral college votes. They just want government that makes sense for their communities. That the vast majority of people who live in my community want the same sort of policy and don't want the policy that's coming from Portland. So we're not thinking, well, what's this going to do to the presidential election? But that is exactly the way that the politicians think, and it's exactly the way that the legislators think, and so that is a point of resistance, as you said. Now, in our case, in Oregon, it's actually not as big a piece of point of resistance as it would be in other places. Like I referenced Illinois and Indiana. You're talking about moving, a couple million people. That's 2 or 3 electoral college votes. In the case of Eastern Oregon, there's only 400,000 people that live here. So we can move that, which is only about a half of an electoral college vote. So the only thing that would change is that those 400,000 people would move from Oregon governance to Idaho governance, and their our federal representative, which currently represents us, which is already Republican, because everybody that's elected in Eastern Oregon is Republican, because it's just very, very conservative. That representative would be a representative of Idaho instead of Oregon. So you're talking about one electoral college vote out of 538 total. So it's less than 0.2% impact on federally. Doesn't affect any state senators. So there's incredibly minimal national impact with what we're trying to do. That would not necessarily be the case with other state border adjustments, but with ours, it is. And even more so, the state of Oregon just got a 6th representative, federal representative in the last census. We are slated to lose that representative anyways, because more people are moving out of Oregon than are moving into Oregon. Oregon is actually shrinking because people are fleeing the deep blue state governance, and more people are leaving our state to go to red states than are moving in. So Idaho is already slated to gain an electoral college vote, a new representative, and Oregon is already slated to lose one. Moving these 400,000 people wouldn't affect that at all.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And
Mhm.
something I thought about as you said this is, maybe if you let the states draw better lines to represent its people, maybe some of these blue states will stop losing people too, right? I
Well,
just realized
absolutely.
that.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm almost thinking about leaving California. I'm not the only one, man. So like
Well,
maybe
there's
if,
a
yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
there's a reason why Idaho has been one of the 5 fastest growing states in the country for the last 5 years, and it's because if you live on the West Coast like we do, so you're in Oregon, California, Washington, the closest place that has real conservative governance is Idaho, and so people they flock there because Idaho is only 5 hours from me, as opposed to, I don't have to go to the South or something or Florida to get conservative governance. I can just go to Idaho, and I'm comfortable with it, and I'm familiar with it, and I'm still close to my family that's still in Oregon. And you've seen that Idaho is just exploding because of so many blue state refugees, political refugees that are looking for conservative governance. If we redraw the borders, then those people don't have to do that. People don't have to abandon their homes and their families and their communities. They can stay where they're at and get government that actually makes sense for them. It truly is. State border relocation is a win-win for everybody involved if we just have the courage to do it.
Yeah. And okay, so let's say the state legislature in Oregon, they finally realized, okay, let's represent our people better. Let's move this movement forward. What would be the next step? Eventually, would you need to get the federal national government approval? So tell me about that process
Yeah,
down the road.
so that's exactly right, Jerry. So the process, the federal government, the U.S. Constitution gives the states enormous power and rights, and one of those rights is to determine their borders, their own borders. So a state can determine its own border, but in relation to other states, the U.S. Congress needs to approve. So if the Oregon legislature relents and they say, okay, fine. We see how this benefits you. We see how this benefits the people that would remain in Oregon. We're going to talk with Idaho. We're going to figure this out. Whatever that interstate compact, that contract that they draw up that moves the border and says we both agree to this, that would then have to be approved by Congress. Historically, Congress has approved the vast majority of these kinds of compacts because, again, which makes sense, if you have a deep red state like Idaho and a deep blue state like Oregon, and they say, hey, this is going to work for both of us, this is a win for both of us, why would the U.S. Congress fight that? Especially if there's very little federal impact, which in the case of Eastern Oregon, there would be. So we do not see congressional approval as any kind of a barrier. The barrier that has always been there for our movement has been the Oregon legislature. And we've always known, and people, have always known this, that governments that control people, land, resources are not quick to just willingly let those things go. Even if the people there vote for it, we've always known that was going to be the highest hurdle. It's what we've butted up against. We've gone through the process. We know that people want this to happen. We know the state of Idaho wants us. We know that the U.S. Congress would likely approve it, but we have to figure out how we can get the Oregon legislature, who doesn't have to let us go. They don't have to do the right thing. Most people would say, well, just do the right thing. Like, these people voted to leave, just let them go. Well, the Oregon legislature doesn't have to do the right thing. They control us and they don't have to let us go. So how do we get the Oregon legislature to do the right thing, to listen to the will of the people and let us go? That's our challenge. That's the wall we're up against now. And it's where our movement is hoping. So we have been, to Salem. We have met with, multiple legislators dozens of times to try to convince legislators to let us go. We're not getting very far with that. So we have appealed to the federal government. We've appealed to the Trump administration to say, hey, can you come in on our behalf and can you advocate for the people of Eastern Oregon? These people have voted to separate. They're being held against their will by the Oregon legislature. Can the federal government come in and say, hey, Oregon, this is not okay. We don't do this in the United States. We don't hold people captive against their wishes. We let voters decide what they want. You need to let these folks go. So we've appealed to the federal government, and we're hopeful that the federal government will intervene and help bring Oregon to the table.
That makes sense. And then I assume, you've done the votes in 13 out of the 17 counties, right? I assume if you get the other 4 counties that officially expressed, that'll probably give you guys more power too.
Sure. And yes, absolutely. Because that is, you're 100% right, Jerry. This is what gives our movement power, is that it's the people who voted on it. And like, anybody can have an idea. Anybody can say, I think we should do this, but there's no power behind that until it's the people who say we want this to happen. And that has been our superpower as a movement, is that we've gone directly to voters and they have given us the okay and said, yes, do this. So yes, getting those last 4 counties would be fantastic. We know already, though, we've done this 13 times. We know that people in those counties want to do this, which is why we've moved forward with this process. We have always advocated that once an interstate compact is drawn up, if we can get Oregon and Idaho to draw up an interstate compact, say we're going to move the border here, that we would go back to a vote of the people that are affected, the people of Eastern Oregon, and say, now that you know, here's where the border is going to go, here's the details. Do you still want to move forward with this? And we're very, very confident that we could go back. When we go back to the voters, they would say yes. Because again, Eastern Oregon is far more similar to Idaho in every way than they are to Western Oregon. And the vast majority of people who live out here would rather have the governance of Idaho than Oregon's.
The last 4 counties on your list, are there votes scheduled in the future, or are there any kind of unofficial kind of surveys done in the future?
Yeah, it's another great question. So 2 of the counties that are left on our list, we are not going to go to a vote for, and that's because we're choosing to split those counties. So where I live in Crook County, which is right next to Deschutes County, but I'm about a half hour from there's one kind of metropolitan area in all of Eastern Oregon, and that's Bend. It's a resort, kind of a outdoorsy town, and close to a ski resort. And it's about 100,000 people, and it votes very left leaning. It's very blue. So again, because we're a movement about self-determination and getting people government that makes sense that they want, we're not going to force the people. We know the people in Bend would not want to be part of Idaho. They vote just like Portland. So they would want to stay part of Oregon. So we're not going to force them into Idaho just because they're, on this side of the mountains. It's an invisible line. We'll draw around them.
Yeah.
And the same is true. There's a Native American reservation in Jefferson County up north. So a couple of those counties we are not voting at all, and the other two counties just haven't. It's kind of a complicated process of how we get on the ballot, and it just hasn't happened yet. But again, we know at this point, most likely those people are going to vote yes. We also know that people are going to get a second chance if this moves forward, and there's people in those counties that are like, well, no, we didn't want this to happen. We also know people are going to get a second chance to vote on this once they know the details. So, again, where we're at and what needs to happen next is, how do we get a governing body that doesn't have to relinquish control? How do we get them to respect the will of voters and relinquish control, or at least come to the table? And that's the challenge. And that's where we need not only the support of the federal government, but it's why I love coming on programs like yours and talking to the people, because the people across our country believe that's wrong. A vast majority of people believe it's wrong to hold people captive against their wishes, that the will of the voters should be what happens. And it's wrong to say, well, I know you all voted to do this, but tough, I'm not going to let you. We need that pressure. We need pressure from the rest of our country on the state of Oregon to say, state of Oregon, what are you doing out there? Like why are you holding people captive who voted to say they want to just peacefully separate, not take anything from you? We need people across the country to start putting some social pressure on the state to do the right thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I also want to emphasize that I love the planning you guys have already done. It's like, okay, some of these counties, maybe there's areas that will vote blue, so we don't want to force them to join our movement either, right? That's
right.
Very, like, you practice what you preach. It's like, okay,
absolutely,
Bend area, if you guys want to remain in Oregon, you guys do so. We're not going to try to drag you over. So yeah, like,
that's right.
You're practicing what you preach.
Yeah, and Jerry, it's the beauty of that political tool. It's an invisible line that you can place wherever you want to. It doesn't have to go across the top of a ridge. It doesn't have to go on a river. It can go where it makes sense. And we already do this every 10 years. We redraw congressional districts with invisible lines to group people politically. And some of those, people hate the way we do that because we gerrymander. We take groups, we make these areas that are not natural and don't naturally group people because Team Red and Team Blue do it for political advantage instead of actual representational purposes, which is what it's meant for. But the purpose of redrawing congressional districts is to group similar people so that they have a representative that represents that specific people group. And that's a good thing. And that's something that we already do every 10 years. Nobody gets upset that your congressional district changes if it needs to. It's an imaginary line. It's an invisible line that you put where it makes sense politically. State borders are the same way. Just because it's a tool that we haven't used extensively in over 100 years does not mean it's a tool that we should just throw out. It's actually a tool we need to bring back, and it could solve a lot of problems.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think that could solve a lot of the polarization things. One question I have is, do you have a case study of the last time it was used?
Yeah. So borders have changed actually fairly recently, but not in significant ways. So for instance, Oregon and Washington changed their border in 1958, right? But it just moved. It moved a very small amount in the Columbia River. It's like where the rivers change course. Often rivers are boundaries, and rivers change course over time. And so there was some question like, okay, where's the line? Is there land? Has the river changed, and is there land now in which state? We need to firm this up. So they went through this exact process. Wow. They went through the Interstate Compact process, went to a vote of the people, and they confirmed it. So it has happened recently, but it hasn't moved hundreds of thousands of people from one state to another. The last time that happened in a significant way was with West Virginia and Virginia. Carving out a new state from an old state. There's been counties that have moved from one state to another. Maine was created out of Massachusetts. Again, most of the big changes like this happened well over 100 years ago, when we were kind of still filling in the map across the country and organizing into the original 50 states. But again, just because the map got filled in doesn't mean this is a tool that we need to throw out the window. It's actually a tool that we should be using. And this is not something that, we don't advocate every 10 years change state borders. But it's been 168 years. And this seems like something that you could once in a generation actually ask the people and say, does this still make sense for you? Or
Yeah.
would it make more sense? Nobody alive today had any say in where this border was placed. It was just here. And we were forced into these associations with people, whether we liked it or not. We've never had a say in it. Our movement has actually said, let's actually ask people what they want.
Yeah.
And what we found out is that the people in Eastern Oregon don't want to be associated with Western Oregon. They want to be associated with Idaho.
Yeah. And I really appreciate you sharing. And I'll just very quickly show this, guys. This is precedent right here, the 1950s. Like, thank you for sharing this. Like, the law is there online. You guys can look at it. Oregon and Washington redrew a little bit of the border because the river shift. Like, this was, look at this. This was done. So, like, here's an example of precedent. Like, states, again, they use that word, Interstate Compact. You see? There's like, they use that word. This should be taught in schools. Most of our government classes, at least I went to school in the DC area, right? NSL, national, state, local, right? Where was the state? Where was the local stuff? Like, Interstate Compact's an example of state, local, right? We should be learning this stuff. But yeah, like, here's a perfect, see, Interstate Compact right here.
Yep.
And look at that. It just details, okay, like, where's the new borders, right? Like, it happened in the 50s between Oregon and Washington. So, guys, this is awesome. Like, this is an example of a precedent. So, yes, thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And like I said, it's happened dozens of times. States have done this. And there's been even more recent than that. That's just one that's local here. This is a process. It's completely legal. There is a legal process and precedent. And it's something that we could break out and use to make people's lives better.
Yeah. And that's, people who've been following my channel know my whole goal is to remind everyone, go learn, go think, right? Whatever you hear, look it up, but don't look it up. You got to look it up smart, right? That's what I showed you. Like, I looked at their website and then I looked at actual laws, right? Like, look up legit sources. And once you look it up, you can get past assumptions. A lot of people's assumptions, like, how can this be possible? Or how is this legal? But it's like, this is something that states have done all the time.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely.
That's the most important hurdle for people to get past. If I didn't look up this law, I wouldn't have not known that, okay, even in the 50s, states have shifted their borders. This is something that happens and should happen more because we're a representative democracy. Representative is the most important thing. And I will even argue that part of why society is so polarized is in every district that's competitive, there's a lot of people that are not feeling represented. That's one of the root causes of this extra polarization, this inability to talk to each other. If for decades you don't feel like your point ever gets across to the people representing you, you're going to be angry. I think it's pretty simple explanation.
Yeah, absolutely. Jerry, one of the things, because people will accuse us of being polarizing, and what we always say is, like, Greater Idaho didn't cause the polarization. The polarization is there. Polarization and tension, polarization just comes from just people being different. And polarization in and of itself is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. People are different. They want different things for their communities. The tension that comes from that is when you take people that are different and you try to force things on them that they don't want in their communities. And that's what happens with our politics. It's okay for Portland to be very different than Eastern Oregon. And that's not in and of itself a bad thing. And it doesn't even cause tension. What causes tension is if the people of Eastern Oregon were to go into Portland and say, no, you can't live that way. You got to live the way we live. Or vice versa, the people in Portland come out to Eastern Oregon and say, well, you got to live the way we live. That's where the tension comes in. That's where the conflict comes in. That doesn't need to be there. Let's use all the political tools we have to stop that from happening and let people have the kind of representation and the kind of government that they actually want.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is quite a good stopping point. I'll give it maybe another 2 or 3 minutes for viewers. I know there's viewers right now watching, but if you guys want to ask some questions, we'll open it up for viewers if you want to ask questions. But I guess while we wait for viewers, if they have any questions, let me ask you, Matt, how many people right now are actively, or I guess your organization, let's start this way. How many people are like actively in the organization right now? So like besides you, how many people work for Greater Idaho Movement?
Yeah, so we're a grassroots organization, Jerry. So we're, you know, I'm the executive director. We have president, vice president, and a leadership team that's, 6, 7 people. And then we have a whole bunch of just volunteers all over the state. And we have, hundreds of individual donors and thousands of people that have signed up for our emails. And so we're a 100% grassroots. Nobody gets paid to do this. This is all grassroots. The people who live here want something better for our communities, for our futures, and advocating, advocating to make that happen. And so we have, again, we're not some idea that had like a $10 million bankroll and astroturfed our way to success. We're at grassroots. Literally, the movement started with some people sitting around a pizza parlor table and saying, how can we solve this longstanding problem? And it's grown from there. Our idea sells itself because, again, most people believe in self-determination. Most people understand that Eastern Oregon and Western Oregon are different, and neither group should be forced into forcing things on the other. It's an easy sell.
Yeah. And I am rooting for you guys. And obviously, the invitation's always there. If you ever want to talk more, or you want other people involved in the movement talk on my channel, feel free to send them my way. And I will end off by saying, I think what you guys are doing, once you guys succeed, this should be done everywhere in America. I think this is what will save America.
I couldn't agree more.
This is the key of what will save America, because the more people don't feel like they have a voice, the more they're not going to believe in democracy.
Yep.
Right? That's the key.
Yeah. This is a tool that will lower the political tension, lower the anger in our country, and get the political power. You talked about the inverted, it's supposed to be like this and it's gotten like this. Yeah. This will help skinny that out again. Yeah. This will help return more local government. And that's when people are the happiest, when their local government matches their values and their way of life. And this will help do that. So Jerry, I really appreciate the chance to come on and speak to your viewers and listeners and have a chance to share about what we're doing. And if people want to support us and help us, go follow us on Twitter at Greater Idaho. Go follow us, or X, I suppose. Go to our webpage, sign up for our emails so you can find out what's going on and help spread the word that there are people out in Eastern Oregon who deserve self-determination and deserve a right to choose their own path.
Exactly. And for those of you who see this later, after it's encoded, so after the live stream is done, leave your comments, please. And we potentially could get someone back next time if you guys have any questions that we can answer. So, yeah, this was Matt McCraw from the Greater Idaho Movement. Again, thank